just to remind ourselves of the context of all of this revolution in the making that Eric talked about, or Dr. Zetscher called it a gold rush, and a gigantic opportunity Roberto Viola talked to us about. But we heard a lot from our opening speakers about, yes, the benefits, but also some of the challenges and the potential risks, and how crucial it is to address those risks. Otherwise, we will not be able to take advantage of this revolution. So, let's get a snapshot of your views. Now, this is very, very simple indeed. In a moment, we will put our first question on the board. You simply press the number on your pad that corresponds to the answer you would like to give. You will have each time 20 seconds to make up your mind. If you change your mind, that's okay. If you press the button again, it will record the last answer you gave before I close the voting. So you'll have a little bit of time to think, and these are all issues that I am then going to discuss with our panel. So, shall we get underway, if everyone has their pad in hand, with our first question? Can we put that up? Where should the focus be in developing the infrastructure Europe needs to reap the full benefits of smart cars? So, should it, number one, should it be on urban environments, given the importance of our towns and cities for mobility and for Europe's economy and society? Should it be on rural areas and highways? Because, as we heard earlier, towns and cities already have much of the infrastructure that will be required. Or can we not choose between the two? Earlier, Dieter said we need 5G everywhere and we need it now. Do we need to focus equally on both? So in terms of where we should focus, should it be our towns and cities? If you think it's there, press 1. If you think it should be rural areas and highways, press 2, and if you really can't choose between the two, but try to, press 3, because this is the focus, not the exclusive use of money. Okay, let's start the voting. I say you have 20 seconds, so... And if you change your mind, you can vote again. So 1, urban environments, 2, rural areas and highways, and 3, investment in both. 5 seconds left. I'm closing the voting now. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, about half of you, as I thought, went for the split option, but very interesting there. Twitter version of this poll had much more emphasis on our towns and cities. Here, you're very evenly divided. 1/4 of you think urban environments, 24%, 21% on rural areas and highways. Okay, question number 2. Roberto Viola said earlier, the dream can be realized if we work together. Who needs to do what to ensure that Europe has the infrastructure it needs? 1, it is mainly the responsibility of governments to address this because of the potential benefits to society widely. 2, it's mainly the responsibility of the private sector because of the potential business benefits. We heard about those new opportunities for business. Does that make it primarily their responsibility? Or 3, and don't cop out and everybody just say 3 because it's the easy way out, do they have an equal and shared responsibility? I am accepting that both sides do have a responsibility. I'm asking you, where is your balance? Is it something that fundamentally governments, the public sector is responsible for, or do you think it's fundamentally something the private sector should be responsible for? Let us start the voting. 20 seconds again. So 1 if you think it's governments, 2 if you think it's the private sector, and 3 if you think it is an equal responsibility. 4 seconds left. Okay, let us have a look at the results. Okay, so 50% of you think this is fundamentally a matter for governments, for policymakers. 26%, 1/4, just over 1/4, the private sector, and just under 1/4 thinks it's equally to both. One last question before I bring our panel up. We talked in our last session about challenges. We want to talk about challenges and then how you answer them. I want to know, and if we could get our third question up now. What do you see as the key challenges ahead to ensure Europe has the infrastructure it needs to reap the full benefits of smart cars? Is it deciding on the priorities for investment in a world of rapidly advancing technologies, or is it ensuring the money, the public. So is it deciding what we spend the money on? Is it ensuring we have enough public money to do it? Or is it making sure that the private sector has the conditions it needs to invest? That partly maybe answers to where you think the money will come from. Will it come from public coffers or private coffers? But one, if you think it's really about deciding what the priorities are, that we need to be very clear where our focus is to invest smartly. Two, if you think it's about focusing on getting the public money that we need to invest. Or three, if you think the overarching focus must be those enabling conditions for the private sector to invest. Let us start the voting. Okay, we are about a third of the way through. So one, if it's about the priorities, the what we should spend the money on. Two, if it's getting the public money. Three, if it's about private money. And the voting is closing now. Okay, let us have a look at the results there. Okay, that's right. So very interestingly, for many of you, it's not clear what we should be spending the money on, let alone then how we're going to find that money. So 40% of you want to focus on the priorities first. Only 13% of you think that the public sector and ensuring the necessary investment from there is the crucial issue, and nearly half of you think it's about creating the right conditions for the private sector, which suggests that you believe, and I'd like to ask our panel later where they think the money should come from, that you believe it will fundamentally come from the private sector, but there needs to be a business case for doing it. And perhaps we can discuss what that right framework is that Eric talked about earlier. So thank you very much for now. Don't lose your pads. I will ask you to use them again a little bit later. But now let me bring our panel onto the stage to discuss what infrastructure will we need to transmit data. So that question of priorities and where the focus should be is one of the key things we're going to address. As I introduce you, panel, please do come up and join me. Joel Schroeder, Vice President, Strategic and Business Development for Inmarsat's Connected Car Program and a member of the EMEA Satellite Operators Association's Networks and Services Policy Group. Joel, very good to have you with us, and why don't you take the end seat there. Next to him, Rousseau, Executive Expert Leader of Corporate Strategic Expertise Area Mobility and Transport Systems in Renault's Corporate Strategy and Business Development Division. A very warm welcome to you, Christian. Nils Skov Andersen, General Manager, Car-to-Car Communication Consortium and a member of the European Telecommunications Standards Institute Board. A very warm welcome to you. Stephen Tass, Chairman of the Executive Board of ETNO, the European Telecoms Operators Association, and Regulatory Director at Proximus. And last but not least, Eddy Hartog, Head of the Unit for Smart Mobility and Living in DG Connect in the European Commission. Very warm welcome. Please make yourself comfortable. Okay, so I've asked our panel not to make any opening statements. We just want to dive into the discussion, and I'm going to ask them a few questions to get us started, and then I will come out to all of you for your comments, and indeed your questions and your comments. There's a lot of expertise in the room. It'd be very interesting to hear your views. So, gentlemen, very warm welcome to you all. I asked our panel at the end there what they thought were the key challenges, and they said, a lot of them, deciding what the priorities are for investment in infrastructure, where we need to focus. Can I ask each of you, and Joel, perhaps I could start with you, in terms of what infrastructure we're going to need, what do you think, where do you think the focus will be, and where are the investments going to be needed? Where is the financing gap going to be biggest that we're going to need to address?
So is this, yep, it's on.
Yep, they're all on, you just speak.
Yeah, so, well, I think there's going to be a vast amount of infrastructure that's required across multiple technologies. I don't think any single technology is going to be able to do everything that's needed for the market. Certainly representing the satellite industry, of course, we see a significant opportunity, but we don't see satellite clearly as an alternative to other technologies. It's a complement. Satellite offers some very unique capabilities that will be critical to enabling things like over-the-air updates, delivery of security patches, enabling GNSS corrections to enhance the precision of navigation systems for automated and autonomous driving. But certainly, I think infrastructure, clearly there's going to be a requirement for investments across all standards. But I think we're talking a lot about 5G today, and while it's clearly a critical requirement for the future of connected car, I think there are requirements in the industry that are going to need to be met before 5G is actually rolled out at the scale that's going to support those near-term requirements. So I think it will be important to focus a lot on driving interoperability between existing networks, traditional mobile networks, 3 and 4G, Wi-Fi, certainly some fixed infrastructure and satellite, to enable those requirements that the auto industry has in the immediate term as we move towards a 5G environment that has a strategy to incorporate those multiple technologies in a more seamless manner.
Okay, so that crucial question, and on the question of where, it's quite striking because in our audience here, when we talked about the where side of it, 24% said urban areas, 21% said rural, and 54% said both. In the Twitter poll that was conducted ahead of this event, 32%, 1/3 said the urban environment, and only 1/5 said rural areas. Do you think the focus needs to be equally on both, or is it true that we already have a lot of what we need in cities? Just a thought on that, if you would, Joel, before I move on to...
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's sort of a tough question. I think a lot of people would assume, again, not to speak entirely on my industry, but I think a lot of people would probably assume that as a satellite operator, we're looking to provide a solution that just fills the gaps. And in fact, that's really not the case. So I think, from my perspective, I think the priority really needs to be looking at the right proportion of investment for both scenarios. I mean, clearly urban areas are going to have a higher percentage of the users. Rural areas are going to be probably more important for the gaps in technology. But if you're looking at supporting the complete range of requirements across the market, for example, if you're deploying satellite for over-the-air updates, well, satellite, I guess, is kind of easy because it's going to reach all of these places naturally without having to build additional infrastructure.
So you would have been in the third category that says we really have to do both. Christian, from your perspective, where should the priorities be in terms of the infrastructure? Where do we need it? And where do we most need investments? Where is the money in shortest supply?
Definitely, it's a matter of phasing. Depending on which use cases or which functionalities we are going to develop on the automotive industry side, depending on the percentage of users, of customers, then we can define where should go the investment, where should go the money. At the moment, we are very much thinking about, for instance, about automated driving. We are thinking about highway pilot or autopilot. And in the meantime, we're also thinking about traffic jam in some limited condition, but this is clearly the type of discussion we need to have with the infrastructure side to define where should be deployed the right level of investment.
But it needs
so
to
it's not a direct answer. It depends on what has to be done first, what should be the best for the either industry and for the customers.
But from a car industry perspective, you feel this emphasis on filling the gaps, if you like, is also very important, that we have quite a lot of the infrastructure we need in urban areas, but the digital highways, as they're often called, that will be a crucial area of focus, without which none of this will really work. It's both.
Both.
It's both.
Yeah,
okay, we'll come back on that. Nils, Skov, Andersen, from your perspective, car-to-car communication consortium, where do you see the priorities in terms of infrastructure, and where do we need the money to be put most?
Yeah, I would have to say that I have a background in mobile communication, actually. And I was a bit surprised listening to the previous discussion here, saying 100% coverage. Knowing that GSM have been around for 25 years, no country have 100% coverage. So if we are waiting for that, then probably we have to wait for a long time. So I think that really we have to apply clever thoughts to how we want to invest. And we have to understand that when we talk about the data from the car, we're not just talking about data. We have data for different purposes. We have information or data for tactical purposes, so basically to avoid colliding with the car nearby, to ensure that two cars can agree to merge, etc. We have strategical data, which is basically saying, oh, there's a traffic jam 5 kilometers down the road, so maybe I should take a different route. And then, of course, there is also what I would call infotainment, things which are not related to driving, keep the kids quiet and at the back seat, and when we have the automated driving, entertain me on the drive. So if you look at those 3 different groups, we have to actually look at what is the requirements. The tactical information, where we avoid collision, that is where we have the hard requirement on high reliability and low latency. But we only need that in a very short-range type communication. The strategical information, we need a wide area coverage for that, and probably also need that for the infotainment. So how do we avoid then to really have a requirement of 100% cellular coverage? Would really be to look at the tactical information and say, is there a way we can deal with that which do not require infrastructure? So the solution to that is basically to go for direct communication between the vehicles. Then in some cases, you might want to communicate with traffic lights and other things, but that would be a spot investment in those places. So I think we really need to apply this kind of the logic, because if you're just waiting for, let's say, 100% 5G coverage, we're going to wait more or less forever.
Okay, but nevertheless, we are, for some of those things, going to need it to be 100%. It's going to need to be seamless. It's going to need to be utterly reliable when we talk about safety and security. So there are areas in which we can't afford to cut corners. There are others, as you say, depending on whether you need the information in real time or later, different functionalities will require different things. Hang on, Christian, I'm going to get everybody's initial comments first, and then I'll let you dive back in.
But I think the advantage of the direct communication is that you only need the communication when there is vehicles around.
Yeah.
And in that case, you also have coverage, because the vehicles hopefully would have the technology built in when we are down the road. So that is basically the way to ensure if we are going to put infrastructure out, especially for safety. If you look in a country like I come from, if you look at a coverage map, a cellular coverage map, see where are the dead spot for the cellular coverage, and then you look on the statistic of traffic accident with fatal traffic accidents. Unfortunately, the maps look very much identical, because the place where there is no commercial need for deploying a cellular network, that is also the place where there's little police and people don't respect the traffic rules and drive too fast.
So that is where the smart car, to use Dieter's word, becomes the dumb car and then the useless car. Let's try to complete this picture from a telecoms operator's perspective, Stephen. We said, as Joel said at the beginning, we need multiple technologies. They are complementary. I think the phrase Eric used earlier was, yes, competing technologies, but also complementary technologies. Where do you think the infrastructure needs are going to be greatest, and where does the money need to go most?
Well, I first would like to refer to what Roberto Viola said. I think he's very much concerned that we would miss a next move in Europe, and it's not because we don't have the right people, because I think we have incredible smart people in Europe, smart engineers, smart business people, but sometimes we're a little bit slow in making things happen. And that's also why I'm so grateful to ASEA. When I met with Erik Schonaar 1 year ago, we discussed about this challenge, and we said we need to bring the people around the table, not to talk about high-level things. We need to bring both industries, car industry and telecom industry, around the table and start to discuss on what is exactly the road to smarter cars, and get away from these high-level discussions. And 1 year later, I think we have made tremendous progress. I think the mutual understanding between telecom industry and car industry has made a lot of progress. We are now on right before the creation even on a formal association, which will be called EATA, the European Automotive Telecom Association, where we really will focus on how can we make it concretely happen, already based on the infrastructures we have today in Europe, because we have already a lot of very good telecommunication networks. But looking ahead of us, of course, we will need a lot of additional investments, that's for sure. Rolling out 5G networks is going to be very capital intensive. But I think as telecom industry, we are really committed to make this happen. Now, what's going to be very key to make this happen is that we have also the right regulatory environment for making that happen. And that's also why Roberto Viola is a very key partner in this process going further. I think what we really need to do in Europe is to create as much incentives for people to build the fast digital networks of the future. And if we can get that, I think we really can get to be in the front of this digital revolution and also the smart car revolution, and we can beat other regions of the world. But we must be honest, I think some other regions of the world on this subject are a little bit in advance to us. Look at what happens with Tesla and things like that. So let's make sure we catch up in Europe, and we show that we can do it even better and faster.
Come back on what sort of incentives are needed, but Eddy, complete the picture for us in terms of the priorities as you see it. And this rural-urban question, because when you look at the 5G action plan, it does talk very much about the highways as well as the cities. Where would you put the focus? Where do you think it's most urgently needed?
I think the most important for all of us is to synchronize the roadmaps for the investments. Because I think one of the difficult things is if you build highways in one place and you invest in cars in another, and then you have the data centers in another place, it's not going to work. And I think that's what we're trying to do, to synchronize these investments, which is not easy with industries that have different investment cycles. So that's the first point I would like to make on the investments. Secondly, where? You rightly talk about investments, and as we just launched the strategy, we say even for the basic features, there's a 3-to-1 return on investment, which is good. So I think you should invest where you get that return on investment first. To be honest, I voted for the urban areas because I think that's where you get the return on investment first. But obviously, when you look at truck platooning, that's not going to be in the urban areas. That's going to be somewhere else. And that is most likely to be a rural area because that's where we've put our motorways. So I think you can do both, but look at the return on investment. Roll it out as quickly as you can with real life cases. That's why we insist on deployment. Most people talk to us about test beds, and the compromise we find is we call it pre-deployment. But we will always be pushing you for the deployment as quickly as possible. So that's where we think the balance can be found.
Okay, I mean, just on that point, and if I could just ask about, in connection with the 5G action plan, when we talk about the challenges, it is difficult to get these upgrades of networks quickly. It's an immense challenge, and we had a tweet from somebody earlier saying people are still paying for the investments they made in 4G, and now we're moving on. When we need to move faster, that point Roberto made very strongly in his opening intervention, how do you see the way? Isn't there a danger here that everyone waits for somebody else to make the first moves, and therefore we don't make progress and we do miss the boat? How do we make sure that doesn't happen?
That is absolutely the danger. You're absolutely right. And that is why I'm delighted with what Stephen just said, but with what the colleagues have been putting together. We now call it the Alliance, we call it something else, but actually you find the industries in one room. And I think that's what Günther Oettinger tried to do, get those people in one room, and you align these roadmaps. That's not necessarily a government business. We also have supporting processes through the industry policy, through the mobility policy that actually allow you to do this. And I think what we've said as government, get out and do it, and we're willing for you to mop up all the regulatory issues that might come on your way. So I think that's quite unique, you know?
A thought on this question of alignment, because as you said, different investment cycles, so on. It isn't as easy to do as it might be when we need these multiple technologies. Stephen, first.
Well, I think we are doing already concrete things on 5G. A lot is happening. You refer to the action plan, so that's also something where the industry has come together and saying, yes, we're going to make a plan on how can we make it accelerate the development of 5G in Europe. I think it was only yesterday that one of our members, Telia Sonera, announced that they will roll out 5G networks in Finland, in Helsinki. So a lot of things is ongoing. What's going to be crucial is that we have a very supportive regulatory environment for the telecom sector. That's going to be very important because it's a sector which have been very heavily regulated, so it was sometimes difficult to make return on investment. I think it's clearly recognized by the Commission now that we need a different kind of approach for the future, because the investment challenge for building 5G networks and all the underlying fiber networks that will feed those 5G networks will be very costly. We've asked a study from Boston Consulting Group, and they estimate the investment above 500 billion. And so it's the same investment calculation that the Commission has made. So this is a big investment. I think it will come mostly from private investment. There was also one of the questions. I think more than 90% will come from private investments. That's the only way to do it. And I think it's important to incentivize those private investment to make the investment. And the dialogue with all the possible users, so car is of course one of the important ones, is very important because we are not going to build a 5G network and then see what the applications could be. Yeah. And I can imagine that the car industry is not going to build a smart car and then say, and now you build the fastest networks. This needs to be very well aligned, that's what you said. The roadmaps need to be aligned.
This synchronicity is key. Nils, from your perspective, how easy or difficult will it be to get that synchronized approach? And what for you, if we can sort of move on as well to this question of what will get that return on investment, what creates the right incentives in order to do this? Because if you agree that 90% of the money will come from the private sector, we need to discuss how the private sector is going to be willing to make those investments.
Generally speaking, I mentioned before that we can describe the data we exchange and the information we exchange in tactical and strategical. So when I look at it, if you want to have somebody to invest, they need to have a business case. So they need basically to have somebody to have a willingness to pay for the information. And if you look at it a bit narrow-sighted, generally speaking, I'm not willing to pay for anything I already can see. So that basically corresponds to the tactical data. So there we have a challenge. When it comes to the strategical data, that is typical information I cannot see. I cannot see there's a queue 5-10 kilometers down the road. I might be willing to pay for that because I can save time. So it's very clearly in that field, there is a number of potential business cases which might finance this. Of course, we also have to be careful that we do not end up with an automated driving where my telecoms bill for the automated driving could have financed the driver. Then maybe I would just choose a driver instead of all the technology. So we need this kind of balance.
Okay. Christian, and you wanted to come in earlier and pick up on something Nils said, and I'm sorry I stopped you because I wanted to get an overall sense of where the panel stood.
No, in terms of business case or in terms of return on investment, on the private side, it's very clear, and Eric has reminded us the rule. If it has no customer value, we have no customer, first point. Of course, at a reasonable or affordable price, at the right level, at the right price. So on the automotive industry side, it's very clear. And in the meantime, as for smart cars, we are also relying on some public investment. Means that if the business case or if the customer value is too much, is depending on the public investment, then that's what I was calling phasing, but synchronizing is even better. But if we can assure phasing at least it might be enough. But we need to have a clear commitment on the public side to invest at the right level of performance, of coverage. And let me go back to the coverage discussion. Everywhere, I fully share your point. We don't need everywhere. We need at the right. We need to move from the population coverage to population plus road coverage on the automotive industry side. Second, we need also to move from the word on the telco industry side, if I well understood, it's a word of the performance is based on the best effort. This is absolutely not sufficient for us. We need to have committed level of performance. We need to work with committed level of performance based on worst case analysis. We don't need to, we cannot rely on an average level of quality of service, which will decrease dramatically when the population, when the communication is multiplied by 10 or 100. We cannot address only one performance, latency. We are always speaking about latency, but latency without flow, without the relevant quality of service is absolutely not. So the investment has to be definitely addressed on the right focus
Can I just ask you, in terms of that question about who needs to do what, and you said we're relying on some public investment and we want a clear commitment. When you say a clear commitment, do you mean financial, or do you mean in terms of creating these incentives to invest that will create the business cases for you? Because it's very striking, our audience, 50% of them said it's the responsibility of governments, above all else, because of the benefit society. 26% said it was all of you, and 24% said both. But I'm wondering, when you talk about a commitment, is it a financial commitment, or is it a framework, a policy framework commitment?
I had a lot of discussion with local authorities. Imagine a mayor or transport responsible of a local municipality, and ask him, are you ready to invest on roadside unit? Are you ready to invest on smart intersection controller? Are you ready to invest on, because we are also always speaking about units on the road, but there is also investment needed for platform, for public platform, for public data platform. Well, this guy cannot answer. He just cannot answer. He needs to have a global, EU-wide policy in order to rely on something, to be sure that he will put the money on the right, in the right
So another, we heard
topic.
Dieter talking about the importance of the EU level for rules. It's also important to have this European target goals framework to work with. Joël, from your perspective, in terms of creating that business case and where the money comes from, Nils said 90% will come from the private sector. Would you agree with that figure? And if you do, what are the incentives needed to get to that 90%? Because as Roberto said, they are huge investments we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think the lion's share of the investment probably will come from the private sector, and you're going to need the right business models to incentivize them to make those investments. I think some of the earlier conversation, I think very much begs for a discussion around how satellite can actually address some of the urban-rural divide that we've been talking about. And certainly, satellite is very much a part of the debate around 5G, and is likely to be a component of a 5G solution in Europe. So satellite can provide that coverage outside of the reach of the other networks. But I think from a business case perspective, simply being that failover or that out-of-coverage solution isn't as interesting for the network operator. I mean, the way we've looked at this market, we see real opportunities for satellite to be part of the primary solution. But of course, once that investment's made to embed a satellite network capability into a car, you have that advantage of being able to use that network as well to reach outside of the coverage of the terrestrial networks. But in terms of the incentive, I think it's finding that right business model, which is a combination of the scale of the market, the recurring business, and finding, I guess it's the price points that are acceptable to the market and to the OEMs while still delivering sufficient return to the operators.
And the role of the policymaker in that, because I was asking Christian earlier about his clear commitment and what he meant. In order to do that, what do they need to do? And frankly, what don't they need to do? What should they stay out of completely? And Eddy, a thought from you on that.
I mean, one of the things I think that hasn't really come up quite yet is around standards. And I mean, I think the policymakers, when it comes to setting standards, I mean, certainly as a satellite operator, we would like to see satellite included in those standards. And I think there's some obvious play for that. I think safety was referenced earlier, talking about the GSM coverage map or the cellular coverage map, and where accidents tend to occur. One of the use cases that we've defined for a satellite solution in a vehicle, once you've made that investment to embed that network capability into the car, could it not be an eCall extension? So eCall runs primarily over a terrestrial mobile network, but if you're out of coverage, why not have that minimum data set be sent over a satellite data network if it's available? It certainly should enhance the overall safety and the response time to any kind of an incident. So I think there are a number of
Eddy, for you, this figure, 90% will come from the private sector, 10% public. Would you agree that that is the way it's going to go? And in terms of creating the incentives, how do you see your role in helping to create these business models?
Yeah. On the figures, I leave that up to the better experts to judge. On the role of the public sector, I have to disappoint you a little bit, because actually you invited the wrong government. You know, you invited the only government level that, first of all, has no money or very little. But I think more importantly, it's the only government level that doesn't own roads or invest
Christian's
in roads.
point, he said, I've been talking to local authorities.
Exactly,
It's the local
exactly. That
level.
is my point. And that's also probably why the vote, I don't think there are many local authorities, regional authorities, or national authorities in the room that would actually look at these figures. But with the little money that we have, first of all, I think I've seen governments working on this. They've not been sitting silent. If I look at the efforts being made in intelligent transport, this is a debate that's been going on for at least 10 years. With the colleagues, but we've been working on this. We developed a strategy yesterday that didn't come just falling from the sky. There's been a long exercise before that. Industrial policy, we started already years ago on this. So we have been taking that responsibility. What we're saying with the little money that we have, we try to facilitate. I look at initiatives like Sea Roads. I look at initiatives in structural funds where we actually say that to local authorities. Well, if you invest in roads of the future, whatever that may be. 10 years ago, that was different from now. But please, we give them that signal. So please use your money intelligently and make sure that with the money we grant you, you invest in the future and not in the past.
Okay. Stephen, you spoke at the beginning about the importance of the incentives. What for you, and I know through the Telecoms Alliance you're looking, one of the issues is there are pilot projects and so on. How do we make sure they have the necessary resource behind them? What sort of, for you, is it incentives, is it financial, or is it creating that policy environment? What for you is the key? What can they do to help, and what, frankly, do they need to leave to industry of whatever sector?
For me, the key thing is to create the right policy environment. I think that will be the biggest differentiator, which really is creating policy rules that stimulate people who want to make the investments we have to make, and to reward them if they make them.
And what do those rules look like? What's
and now we have a regulatory policy in telecommunication which is very strong regulated. Means if you invest, you're immediately confronted with very detailed rules which basically discourage you from doing investments. And so we need to make sure that we give more oxygen to people who say, well, I want to take a risk, I want to invest in 5G technology, I want to roll out new technologies, but I would also like to have the reward and the return on it if I make it happen. So that's going to be very key. Spectrum, of course, is going to be key. And Roberto Viola is doing a lot of work to make sure that there is sufficient spectrum available for 5G technology. 5G technology who will provide quality of service and will be able to provide specific qualities to certain applications. So that's going to be really a very promising technology. But the management of spectrum is going to be key. I think also the way we will deal with data, if it has been touched upon already in the earlier panels, is going to be very important. Let's make sure that we keep rules that are not too complex, because sometimes in Europe we have tendency to make regulations which is very detailed, and if it's too detailed, it's too bureaucratic, nobody understands it, and people who want to develop new business models then move to other parts of the world to make them happen. So that's where I think policy can really make a difference. So it's not so much about putting money in it, but there are maybe areas where we think that the public money could be very useful. I refer to the joint project that we now have between the car industry and the telecom industry. There, I think it would be good if we can have additional research money from the European institutions in order to help kickstart some of those projects. That's certainly something on which we are jointly working, telecom and automobile industry, to make sure that I think Europe there can help us to get kickstarting some of those early projects and tests. Okay. That's an area where they can help.
Okay, thank you. So this panel very much echoing our audience. 47% of you said it was about creating the best possible conditions to foster private sector investment, and only 13% of you actually thought it was the public money, although, as you say, useful areas where that amount of money, and yes, granted, EU, very little money, but also immense constraints on public spending at all levels. Now, Nils, from your perspective, that 90%, the more than 90% that will come from the private sector, what will deliver that 90%? What barriers do we need to address if we're going to get it? So and then I'm going to come out to all of you.
I don't think I ever said 90%, but never mind. But I think we should not forget that there is one part of the private investment we tend not to discuss on. That is the investment of the end user. Because there is, the end user also needs to be encouraged in investing in the let's use the term the smart car or the intelligent car, if they're not willing to pay whatever the extra price for that is, then this is a nice discussion, but it's not going to happen. So I think that is a part of the thing. So, and here we are again back to the trade-off between, let's say, the perceived benefits I get from some of the things I can save time in the driving versus also getting the safety benefit. Because it's very clear when I go and buy a car, I don't plan to crash, it will be my neighbor. So if I have to choose a better stereo or safety, a lot of us would choose a better stereo, unfortunately, but that's life. So, and that is one of the places we also need to consider. How do we encourage people to buy those cars which improve safety, improve traffic management, flow, reduce pollution, etc.
Again, do we need incentives of the type we have seen when it comes to low-emission cars, for example? Do we need those sorts of things to, as you say, that comes back to the customer? That's where we started in our
Yeah, it is very clear. I come from a country where we have a high tax on cars, and traditionally we have been very quick to adopt new safety system in cars, because what the government have done whenever new things came out, ABS brakes, airbags, etc. They basically gave a discount if the car on the tax if the car was mounted, and that worked.
It works.
But of course, not all countries, or luckily not all countries, have like 150 or 200% tax on a car like we have in Denmark. But these things, but it could be road tax, it could be other things which can be kind of used in order to kickstart this. Because we also have to remember, if you are an early adopter here, you might have very little benefit of the service. But in order to really bring the service out there, we need to get a population, so we have somewhere we can collect the data from also.
So you have a slight chicken and egg here, because you want people to invest in the smart car to generate the data that will deliver the benefits, but the first ones will not get the benefits because you don't have critical mass. So how do you overcome so much of a challenge in many areas for the car industry as we look to the future and the mix of technologies that makes this such a challenge? But let's go out and see. I want to come back to the question of working together and realizing the dream that Roberto talked about, but let's go out to the audience and see if there are any questions or indeed comments to what you've heard. Please introduce yourself and please be brief.
Thanks, Jackie. My name is Joost van Tomme from ASEA. I worked in the telecoms for a number of years. And exactly, I agree with what Steven says. And also the package which is putting forward on enabling investments in return for lesser regulatory control and oversight. One question still, hinting to what Eddy said, is on bringing people together, bringing roadmaps together. In the Telecom Alliance with the automotive, we see a lot of initiatives, a lot of national initiatives as well. What we lack a bit is a joint council approach between the telecoms and the transport ministers. And actually today there is both councils all taking place, and they're deciding on geo-blocking and all these kind of things. It would be nice to have these two, I would say, verticals also talking to each other and creating the synergies for our sector, not only for CITS, but other applications.
And what do you think is holding that back? Because you've recognized as an industry you needed to create an alliance. Why isn't that happening at the government level?
It's happening to some extent, but of course, talking to a government is not talking to one person. It's talking to an entity, and you need to find first the right persons, the right focus areas, their business case for societal benefits, and that's not something you just throw on a paper in a corner. So it takes some time. The Sea Roads initiative is a good one, a very good one. So we'd like to support and interact with them in the alliance, but obviously also with the telecoms ministers behind.
Thank you. It'll be interesting to get your thoughts on that, Eddy, because of the way the Commission, this more joined-up Commission, is approaching these issues as well. Other comments or questions to our panel? Anybody want to come in at this point? Okay, let us come. Where is it? Ah, yes, sorry, I didn't see you because of the camera. Apologies. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Denik Wessel from the Czech Auto Industry Association. I have a question. We have heard quite a lot today about the building of the infrastructure, the hardware infrastructure for the 5G networks, etc. I'm quite positive this will happen. I mean, sooner than later, because there's quite a lot of smart brains putting their time into it, and companies. But I think one thing we are missing in the discussion is the name of the game. Mr. Andersen said it. We are talking about the data. working with the data, using the data. So what we are missing right now is also the infrastructure for the software, the platform for the cooperation of the data. We have heard today this analogy with car and mobile phone. So my question is, are we going to see the same on the platform level? Right now, there are these platforms as Android, iPhone. Are we going to see the same fight for the auto industry versus some IT companies? So who is actually going to profit from this development, which will happen? Will it be the auto industry, the telecom industry, or the IT industry itself, which is not present at the moment?
So as you say, well, we see a replication of what has happened in other areas and sectors in this area. Who would like, let's take that point up first, and then we'll come back to the joined up thinking one afterwards. Who would like to come in? Stephen?
I think it's a very good question. If I briefly touched upon it, I think indeed we need to create a good framework for data. There's challenges on the policy side and a challenge on the industry side. I think the industry has to step up a bit efforts to make sure that we have the right platforms there and that we use all the richness of data in a very positive way. That's going to be very important. But it's again there, I think you need to bring both industries together to make sure how you can do this in the most optimal way. That's going to be key. But there's an important role also for policymakers to make sure that the rules in Europe are workable. We still have a little bit of complex framework in Europe. We've only recently adopted a very horizontal approach for data protection, the GDPR, if you're familiar with that. But we have still some lingering other kind of regulations which are sector specific, like e-privacy directive. And so it's a little bit like, I would say, a very complicated spaghetti. And if you have a very complicated spaghetti in front of you, people don't move and don't make sufficiently progress in this domain. So I think there's a lot of work for industry to move faster. If not, it's going to happen elsewhere in the world. And there's already a lot of happening in the US. And there is a role for policymakers to clean up the rule books to make sure it's workable and an environment for industry, and also which provide the right protection for users, because that's key.
Christian, from your point of view and from vehicle manufacturers, of course, you're investing a lot in developing these smart cars. Do you fear that, as has happened in some areas, others will come in from other sectors and steal these great new opportunities from you? No. What do you need as a sector to make sure you can
I already said that we, speaking about platform, we need, and I presented that in terms of investment, because once more, it's a matter of money, of public money. On the private side, we are already working, and we are collaborating with IT industry as well as with the telco industry. So this is not an issue, honestly. From my point, the main issue is that think about public data platform, which might become completely different from a city to another. Think about the architecture of those platforms at a national level, with different architecture and different rules, different specification. Well, on the industry side, we cannot address such a diversity. So there is once more a need for first specification, common specification in terms of architecture, in terms of format, in terms of data specification. And we need also rules, not only harmonized, but as much as possible, as close as possible, the same rules between the different member states and different cities. And that's a key point. And then it's also on the public side.
Okay. Anything else on this point before we move to the question of this joined-up thinking, if I can put it like that? There was a comment from you, or a question and a comment, in terms of the industry is now doing it. We see this alliance between the automotive and the telecom sector. In terms of getting this thinking at government level, do you think between you, for example, and DG Move, going to hear from DG Move a little bit later on, are we getting that joined up thinking that we're going to need in order to do this? Is there other things we need to do? And from the rest of you, in terms of the collaboration, you've talked about collaboration now between your sectors to align roadmaps, but the working together with the policymakers, how well it's working, what, if anything, you want from them in the future. But let's, Eddy, first from you in terms of this joined up thinking.
Joined-up thinking is a fair concern and it's a shared concern. And it's vertical between the various ministries, let's say, but it's also horizontal between the different levels. That's the first point. Secondly, I think we've been doing that. I mean, part of the exercise, if I take again the intelligent transport, is like 5, 6, 7 years ago, we started a conversation with an enormously broad platform to actually see what are the rules. That's the second point. Third point is, at this stage, and I look now at the tentative results coming up from GEAR 2030, they say for the moment, regulation is not the issue. That's the conclusion that we are getting, at least for the short term. I mean, we're looking at the 2020. 2030, of course, there'll be a different story. Not me, not my section, but the colleagues in DG GROW have, for example, already been looking at the United Nations conventions. That's what we're doing. I think our first concern is not to step into regulation in a precipitated manner. We have the advantage that some of these things are not yet regulated, but I see a number of governments, national, regional, maybe even local, a little bit nervous, like, oh, data, there's a lot of things happening, let's get control on this. That is why we have these conversations. At the same time, what we've said with Günther Oetting is say, start testing this and let's see where we have to. I compare it to curling, if you like. You know, when you have...
Oh,
so
when you do the housework.
I see all these gentlemen as part of the ones getting this ball as closely to the center. And Anthony and me and colleagues, we are doing, and Wolfgang, we're the guys with the broom trying to get that as close as possible to you.
I've got this vision of you all. But that does bring us back to a point Roberto made. Quick thought on this, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions from this session. About we need to move fast. He's worried we'll miss the boat. On the other hand, we need to get it right. And you say, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about this in our next session on data and the frameworks for access to in-vehicle data and so on. But how do we square that circle? Which is more important? The speed. So maybe, I think there was an implication from somebody earlier, maybe we don't quite get everything 100% right, but we need to move fast, or getting it right, and if that takes time, so be it. How are we going to square that circle? Christian.
Once more, I will say phased, in a phased way, in a synchronized way, it's another word. If we go too fast in, for instance, the 5G deployment, with not the right level of performance, well, no way, no needs, no value. If we go too slow for the 5G deployments, compared with at the right level of performance, but in comparison with what is done also internationally in the other regions of the world, then we can lose the worldwide competition in terms of industry, in terms of policy, in terms of collective benefits, in terms of many things. So, well, I would very much insist on the needs to have a synchronized or phased approach. If we address some use cases, if we, on the automotive industry side, we want to address some use cases with communication means, let's address those use cases at first and see whether or not it's compatible with the performance of 4G or 5G. On the automotive industry side, we have already made a lot of tests on the G5, CITS G5. So we know what we need. We know what we are expecting.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this speed versus getting it right dilemma?
Getting it done. That's what I started with, I think. Not stop the talking. That's what we did with our dialogue. We said, let's move, let's do things concretely. We should accelerate, I think, a bit. That's going to be important. In fact, we talked about the dialogue between the telecom sector and the auto sector, but it's also DG Connect played a key role from the beginning, because there was always a very important partner in the dialogue that we started last year, and also Commissioner Oettinger has played a key role to make sure that we were able to make the progress we've made until now. But first of all, let's make things happen. I think that's key.
Nils,
stop the talking, let's work.
Well, Nils, you wanted to come in before we draw some conclusions.
Yeah, I think that there was made a comparison with the cellular world. And how did cellular start? They didn't anticipate an iPhone and waited for the iPhone before they started. They started basically with the service, the first service, and they did a phased approach with GSM, then 3G, and then suddenly the iPhone popped up. And I think a lot of the things we want to do, we already have the technology available. A lot of it can be done with 4G. A lot of the more practical regulatory problem and so on, they would be solved just by doing the first services, because then we get the experience and so on. So let's stop discussing the technology and etc. Let's accept we have tested some technologies which are able to be deployed. Okay. As Christian said, the Eddy G5, we can go and deploy that in combination with the existing cellular network, and we can get started on that. And then, in order to deploy that, we need to fix some of the basic issue about the data protection, okay, the security, etc.
But we already can make a good start. Joel, a very quick one if you would, and then we'll draw some...
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that's striking me with this conversation is that we've seen recently announcements by some major players in the auto industry, some of the OEMs, about accelerating their autonomous programs and actually having fully autonomous systems running by 2020. I suspect that... Well, I shouldn't say suspect, but I think one of the questions is, to what extent will the industry actually drive this, or drive the pace of this, and will the regulators, in some cases, be chasing the industry because they will not have settled on final policy, and the industry will just drive with whatever solutions they can get their hands on.
Okay, so if we are to get it done, and just get on with it. Eddy, for you and for all of you, in a sentence each, because that's all we have time for, what for you is the most important priority? What, as we leave this room, you don't want to talk about it anymore, you want to do it. What do we need to do first? What's the key next step to deliver the infrastructure we're going to need to begin to realize all this potential? One sentence each. Eddy first.
It's very simple. Get deployment on the road.
Review our policies so that we incentivize as much private investment as possible.
That's where you need to focus first. Nils?
I think we need basically to go with the day one CITS services exactly in the direction as in the Commission communication yesterday.
So we're on the right track, just do it. Christian?
As a complement, start to discuss the specification of 5G, which have to meet, which will have to meet our performance requirements.
Thank you very much. Well, you have the last word.
I guess I mentioned it once before, a standards discussion, not necessarily so much to drive or to dictate the technologies that need to be used, but to better facilitate conversations about the various technologies, their role, and the partnerships that can be formed between public and private.
Thank you, and thank you for ending on that partnership note, because that is where I think recurring through our discussions all the time, the importance of doing it together. You have been a great example of doing it together, discussing it together. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you.